My name is Aaron Bell, and I work pest control. Not the kind people imagine when they hear the job title. I don't deal with rats in kitchens or ants in walls. I handle structural infestations, long-term neglect, the kinds of problems that only show up when a building has been left alone long enough for something else to move in. I don't believe in giant spiders. I believe in bad maintenance. That's why the call didn't sound unusual at first. The property manager described it as excessive webbing in a condemned apartment building scheduled for inspection. No tenants, no utilities, no recent access. Just complaints from nearby businesses about webs drifting into adjacent structures. He used the phrase, load-bearing amount, then laughed and apologized for it. I didn't laugh. I've learned that when people joke about something they don't understand, it usually means the problem has already gone too far. The building was 6 stories, poured concrete, built in the late 70s. Structurally sound on paper, but neglected in practice. The kind of place where moisture settles and stays. Perfect for insects. Perfect for things that feed on insects. The exterior webs were visible before I even parked. They weren't the messy kind you see under eaves or around light fixtures. These were long, clean strands stretched deliberately between corners of the building and nearby structures, anchored high, under tension. That stood out. Most spiders don't waste silk like that. Inside, the air was still. No drafts, no debris blown in. The lobby was clear except for webbing layered across the ceiling like reinforcement mesh, thick in places, threaded tight. I set up my equipment and began documenting. That's when I noticed the notice. A laminated sheet taped to the wall just inside the maintenance office. Yellowed, but intact. Printed in block letters. Web interaction guidelines. I assumed it was a joke left by a previous crew. There were 3 points listed. Do not remove webbing without marking tension points. Do not cut strands under load. Do not fill gaps created by web removal. It wasn't written like a warning. It was written like procedure. I took a photo for my report and moved on. The first floor inspection was uneventful. Web density increased near cracked beams and stress fractures, which made sense. Spiders like vibration-dampened areas. The webs themselves were unusually thick, layered over time, but still within the realm of possibility. On the second floor, I noticed something else. The webbing wasn't just attached to walls and ceilings, it was wrapped around support columns. Not randomly, not loosely. Positioned. Almost braced. I marked it as unusual behavior and continued upward. By the 3rd floor, the building felt quieter. Not empty, just balanced. The way a structure feels right before someone makes a mistake in it. I radioed in my preliminary assessment and told the office I'd need more time than expected. They asked if there was a risk of structural damage. I looked at the webbing stretched across a cracked support beam, pulled tight like a cable. I said no, at least not yet. I cut the smallest strand I could find, just enough to test reaction. The web didn't collapse. Instead, somewhere above me, something shifted, not scurrying, not moving fast, adjusting. The floor creaked once, then settled. I stood still for a full minute, listening. Nothing else happened. I logged the observation and told myself what I always do. Buildings make noise. Spiders don't coordinate. And whatever was holding this place together had nothing to do with me. I finished the first floor without further incident. The strand I'd cut stayed severed. No immediate replacement. No movement I could see. That reassured me more than it should have. Spiders react quickly when their work is disturbed. The lack of response suggested either absence or scale. On the 2nd floor, I slowed my inspection. I started marking tension points the way the guidelines had suggested. Chalk lines on the concrete. Tape tags on anchor points. It wasn't something I normally did for webbing, but the layout demanded it. The strands crossed at specific angles, layered in patterns that reminded me of reinforcement mesh rather than traps. The webs weren't meant to catch prey. They were meant to distribute weight. That realization didn't scare me. It confused me. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I'd mapped enough to see the pattern clearly. Every major concentration of webbing aligned with a stress point in the building. Cracked beams, sagging ceilings, warped door frames. The older the damage, the thicker the web. Where the concrete was strongest, there was almost no silk at all. I documented everything. Photos, measurements, notes. The report was already going to be longer than usual. I remember thinking the property manager wouldn't like the invoice. On the 4th floor, I found the first sign that someone else had noticed this before me. A faded inspection tag was tied into a strand near a stairwell. Old laminate, handwritten date, no company name. Just initials I didn't recognize. It hadn't been wrapped accidentally. It had been placed. That's when I went back and looked again at the guidelines. Do not remove webbing without marking tension points. Do not cut strands under load. Do not fill gaps created by web removal. The language wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Someone had learned these rules the hard way. I started to wonder how long the webbing had been here. Not weeks, not months. Years, maybe longer. Long enough to become part of the structure. On the 5th floor, the building changed. The air felt heavier, not humid, compressed. Sound didn't carry the same way. My boots landed softly, like the floor was padded. Webbing covered nearly every surface. Not chaotic. Ordered. Thick bands ran from wall to wall, ceiling to floor, intersecting at calculated intervals. Some were so dense they obscured the concrete behind them. I noticed something else too. The webbing was warm. Not hot. Not alive. Just slightly warmer than the surrounding air. Warmth holds tension better. That's basic material behavior. I stopped moving. The building responded. Not immediately. Slowly. A long strand overhead tightened. Just enough to shift weight. Somewhere below, concrete settled with a low, relieved groan. The structure felt better. I stood there longer than I meant to, testing it. A step forward. A pause. A step back. Each movement caused subtle adjustments in the web. Tension redistributed. Load transferred. The building corrected itself around me. I was part of the equation now. That's when I realized why no one had complained about infestations inside the building itself. The webbing wasn't spreading outward. It was contained, managed, maintained. On the 6th floor, I finally saw movement. Not a spider. A section of web shifted along a beam, sliding into a tighter configuration. No legs, no body, just structure responding to stress. I radioed the office again and told them I'd need to revise my assessment. They asked if the infestation was active. I looked at the webbing braced around a cracked column, holding it steady like a cast. I said it was doing its job. They asked me to clarify. I said I'd call back. I didn't cut anything else. I followed the guidelines instead, and the building held. By the end of the 2nd day, I stopped thinking of the building as abandoned. Abandoned buildings degrade. They rot. They collapse slowly and loudly, shedding pieces until nothing of value remains. This place wasn't doing that. It was being maintained. Just not by people. I started part 3 the way I start every inspection, by checking what someone else has already done. The maintenance office was on the 1st floor, tucked behind what used to be a laundry room. Most of the cabinets were empty, but one filing drawer was still locked. I didn't force it. The webbing around the handle was thick, layered, and under visible tension. Instead, I checked the wall behind it. Someone had written notes directly onto the concrete. Faded marker, overwritten several times. Do not cut near stairwell B. Ceiling load transfers through webs. Removal causes redistribution. None of it sounded panicked. It sounded corrective. I followed the notes to stairwell B. The webbing there was denser than anywhere else in the building, thick enough to dull sound completely. When I leaned close, I could feel vibration through it. Slow, rhythmic adjustments responding to the structure's weight. I didn't touch it. Further up the stairwell, I found more inspection tags. Different dates, different handwriting. No company names, no final reports. Just initials. I recognized one of them. It was mine. Not from this job. From years ago. A routine inspection in a different building. Same pen, same shorthand. Same way I underline load warnings twice instead of once. That shouldn't have been possible. I checked the date on the tag. It was 2 years in the future. I took a photo. The photo didn't save. On the third attempt, my phone displayed an error message I'd never seen before. File rejected. Redundant record. I put the phone away. On the 4th floor, I noticed something else. Paths. Not literal markings, but clear roads through the webbing. Open corridors where strands curved away from foot traffic, forming just enough space to pass comfortably. Other routes were blocked entirely, webbing layered thick and tight like warning tape. The building wasn't just supporting itself, it was directing movement. I tested it. I stepped off one of the open paths. The response wasn't immediate. It never was. A strand behind me tightened. Another ahead slackened. The floor shifted slightly, enough to throw off my balance. I stepped back into the cleared path, the tension released. It wasn't punishment, it was correction. By mid-afternoon, I stopped logging things digitally. I used paper instead. The building didn't seem to mind that. The webbing adjusted regardless. What bothered me wasn't the spider. It was the absence of one. No molts, no droppings, no egg sacs, nothing that suggested a biological life cycle. Just structure, adjustment, maintenance. On the 6th floor, I found the roof access door. It was sealed with webbing thicker than any I'd seen yet. Reinforced, integrated into the door frame. Cutting it would mean redistributing stress across multiple floors. The guidelines hadn't mentioned doors, but the intent was clear. Some areas were not meant to be accessed anymore. I stepped back. The webbing relaxed slightly. That's when I understood something important. The building didn't react to fear. It reacted to force. I wasn't being hunted. I was being incorporated. By the morning of the 3rd day, I knew I wasn't finishing the job the way I'd planned. The report was already useless. You can't invoice a building for cooperating with an infestation. You can't recommend removal when removal would compromise the structure. I needed to pull my equipment, reassess, and bring in people with authority to make decisions I couldn't. That was the plan. I packed my tools carefully. Sprayer first, then the cutter, then the diagnostic sensors. Each time I moved something heavy, the webbing around me shifted. Not to block me, but to compensate. It felt like the building was making room. I carried the first case toward the stairwell. The moment I crossed the threshold, the floor dipped. Not collapsed, not cracked. Just a subtle change in angle, enough to make me stop. I set the case down immediately. The pressure eased. I tried again, slower this time. Same result. The building wasn't preventing me from leaving. It was responding to weight removal. I moved the case back into the room. The floor leveled out. That's when I noticed the strand around my boot. It wasn't wrapped, not restraining, just touching the sole, thin as thread, warm. I lifted my foot. The strand stretched, adjusted, then reattached to the floor beside me. It hadn't been placed there. It had been waiting. I tested it. A slow step forward. The strand followed, lengthening without tension. Another step. Still no resistance. When I stopped, it tightened just enough to hold. Not trap. Anchor. I cut it. The response was immediate. Somewhere above me, webbing snapped. Not loudly, but decisively. A sharp redistribution of tension rippled through the building. Concrete groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling. I froze. The building held, but only barely. The guidelines hadn't warned against cutting small strands. They hadn't needed to. I didn't move again until the structure settled. I radioed the office and told them I was aborting the job. The radio crackled, but no response came through. I tried again. Different channel. Same result. The webbing near the radio antenna had thickened. I didn't know when that had happened. I decided to leave without equipment. The stairwell path was still open. I followed it carefully, stepping only where the webbing curved away. The building adjusted with me, redistributing load smoothly. Halfway down, I heard a sound I hadn't heard before. Not skittering, not crawling. A deep, resonant vibration, traveling through the web like a plucked cable. Slow, deliberate. The building was reacting to loss, not of weight, of function. On the second floor, the webbing changed configuration. Strands shifted across the corridor, narrowing the path behind me while leaving the route ahead clear. It wasn't blocking me, it was directing me. I reached the lobby and stopped. The exit door was unobstructed. No webbing across the handle, no visible reinforcement, but the floor beneath it sagged noticeably. If I stepped forward, the building would compensate. If I stepped forward with nothing to replace what I'd been doing, the building would compensate differently. I understood then why the guidelines existed. The web wasn't reinforcement. It was a system. And I had been part of its maintenance cycle. I turned back. The vibration eased. The building stabilized. The web loosened around the stairwell, opening the path again. I went back upstairs and unpacked my tools. When I set them down, the strand touched my boot again. This time, I didn't cut it. I stayed because leaving would have made things worse. That was the logic I used at the time. It was clean, professional. The same reasoning you use when you shut off a valve instead of walking away from a leak. The building wasn't hostile. It was unstable. And instability is something I knew how to manage. I began treating the webbing as infrastructure. I stopped thinking in terms of removal and started thinking in terms of load paths. I traced strands with chalk, marked anchor points, noted where tension increased when I moved and where it relaxed when I stayed still. The web responded immediately, not intelligently. Predictably, when I stepped into a weakened area, strands thickened. When I lingered near a crack, tension redistributed away from it. The building felt better when I was where the web expected me to be. That expectation was becoming clearer. By midday, the webbing around the stairwells had shifted into something resembling a harness. Not tight, not restrictive, just present. Threads brushed my shoulders, my arms, my back, always in the same places. Anchor points. I didn't panic. Panic leads to force. Force leads to collapse. Instead, I worked. I found personal effects embedded in the webbing on the fourth floor. A glove, a hard hat, a radio clipped neatly into a knot of silk. None of it was wrapped or cocooned. It had been placed, then built around, preserved. I checked the radio, it powered on. Static at first, then a low, steady hum. The same vibration I'd been feeling through the floors, translated into sound. I turned it off. The hum stopped. The building shifted. I turned it back on. The vibration settled. I left the radio where it was. On the 5th floor, I found what passed for a maintenance record. Not paper, not digital. A section of web thicker than the rest, layered in repeating patterns that mirrored movement paths. Where strands overlapped, I could see residue. Skin oil, fabric fibers, dried sweat, human contact points, repeated use. This wasn't a nest, it was a worksite. The spider still hadn't appeared, but something large moved when I stopped moving. Not close, not fast. Somewhere deep in the structure, tension changed direction as if a massive frame had adjusted its stance. I realized then that the spider wasn't occupying the building. The building was occupying the spider. I was a small, replaceable part of that balance. Late that afternoon, the web guided me to a specific location on the 3rd floor. A cracked support beam I'd flagged earlier. The strands there thickened as I approached, tightening around my forearms and torso. Not enough to bind, just enough to hold me in place. The beam stopped creaking. I stayed there for hours. The building stabilized. When I tried to step away, tension increased elsewhere. Audible this time, concrete protesting, webbing straining. I went back. The noise stopped. That was the first time I understood what I was being used for. Not food, not prey, support. I logged the observation on paper. The web tightened slightly, like approval. I didn't tear the paper free when a strand brushed it. I let the web take the weight. At some point, I stopped checking the time. Not because I couldn't, but because it stopped meaning anything. The building had its own rhythm, and once I started working within it, hours became less useful than tension. I noticed the pattern when I tried to rest. I sat on the 3rd floor stairwell landing, back against the wall, tools set down neatly beside me. The webbing there loosened slightly, creating space. I closed my eyes. The vibration increased, not violently, not alarmingly, just enough to keep me awake. The building didn't want me lying down. Not there, not yet. I stood. The vibration eased. That was when I realized the web wasn't just distributing weight, it was managing behavior. I tried again on the 5th floor, where the web was densest. The strands shifted to support my back and shoulders, forming something close to a sling. When I sat, the vibration dropped to a low hum. Rest approved. I slept for what felt like minutes. When I woke, the light outside the windows hadn't changed. The building didn't care about day or night. It cared about load cycles. I ate where the web allowed, drank when the vibration dipped, moved when paths opened, stopped when tension rose. I wasn't being watched. I was being scheduled. That afternoon, I tried to call for help again. I climbed to the roof access, careful not to touch the sealed door. The web guided me instead toward a maintenance hatch I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't blocked. It was framed, strands reinforcing the edges like a collar. I opened it. The radio signal went through for half a second, long enough for someone on the other end to say my name. Then the web tightened around the antenna, not crushed, not disabled, just redirected. The voice didn't come back. The building settled into a deeper, steadier vibration, like relief. I stopped trying. Later, while adjusting web tension around a cracked beam, I felt a change that wasn't structural. A shadow moved across the webbing overhead. Not a body, a redistribution. The strands above me pulled inward, then outward, like something massive had shifted its weight across them. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I could feel the scale in the way the building responded. This wasn't a single spider. It was a framework of limbs spread across multiple floors, too large to move quickly, too integrated to leave. When it adjusted, the entire structure answered. The web didn't belong to the spider. The spider belonged to the web. That night, if it was night, I noticed something else. The web began tightening around my wrists and ankles, not to restrain, to mock. When I stood in the wrong place, tension rose sharply. When I returned to approved positions, it eased. The building was training me, teaching me where I was needed. I stopped resisting. The moment I did, the vibration softened. For the first time since I arrived, the structure felt complete. And somewhere deep inside it, something enormous stopped moving. Once I understood that the building had expectations, I started noticing how old those expectations were. The webbing wasn't uniform. Some strands were newer, bright, elastic, responsive. Others were dull, dust-coated, layered over with age. Where those older sections intersected, the silk was thick enough to be opaque. Those intersections mattered. On the second floor, behind what used to be a utility closet, I found a cluster of those older strands woven into a tight lattice. Embedded within them were objects that didn't belong to the building. A tool belt, a pair of safety glasses, a clipboard, its paper long since fused into the web. Nothing was damaged. Everything was positioned deliberately, balanced so the weight pulled evenly across multiple strands. Anchors. I didn't touch them. The web around the cluster tightened slightly when I approached, then relaxed when I stopped. A warning, not a threat. Nearby, scratched into the concrete, were dates, not written all at once, added over time, different handwriting, different tools. Each date spaced months, sometimes years apart. None of them ended with a final note. They just stopped. I followed the path of older webbing upward, tracing how it had been reinforced and repaired over time. Wherever the structure showed signs of stress, there were signs of human presence integrated into the web boots, set heel down against beams, gloves wrapped around tension points, radios clipped where vibration would carry best. They weren't trophies, they were components. That night, I dreamed for the first time since arriving. I was standing in the building exactly where I'd fallen asleep. In the dream, I wasn't alone. Shapes moved above me, vast and slow, each motion redistributing tension across the structure. I didn't see a spider. I saw the building being held together from the inside. When I woke, the webbing had shifted again. Strands around my chest and back were thicker now, reinforced overnight. My movements were guided more precisely. The building no longer reacted to me, it anticipated me. I found a maintenance log on the 4th floor. Not written. Assembled. Strands had been woven into patterns that mirrored paths I'd walked the day before. Where I'd paused, the web was thicker. Where I'd hesitated, it branched. A record of movement. A record of utility. That's when I noticed the absence. There were no child-sized anchors. No small shoes. No light equipment. Everything embedded in the web had belonged to adults. Professionals. People who knew how to stand still when something heavy depended on them. The building didn't take victims, it took workers. Later, the web guided me to a new position on the 5th floor, near a column that had begun to shift overnight. The strands wrapped around my arms and shoulders more firmly this time, bracing me in place. I stayed. The column settled. The vibration eased. Somewhere above me, something massive adjusted, and then became still again. I didn't hear skittering, I didn't hear breath, just the sound of a system operating within tolerance. I understood then that I wasn't the first pest control contractor to walk into this building. I was just the most recent. I stopped wondering whether anyone knew about the building. The question became how much they knew and how long they'd been willing to work around it. The documentation was hidden in plain sight, on the first floor behind a false wall in what used to be the property manager's office. I found a filing cabinet bolted to the concrete. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. The webbing around it was dense enough to discourage curiosity. The cabinet contained inspection reports. Not mine, not recent, decades old, some of them. City letterhead, private contractors, structural engineers, pest control companies I recognized, some that no longer existed. Each report followed the same pattern: initial assessment, identification of non-standard reinforcement, recommendation to postpone removal pending further review, no final disposition, no closure. Several reports referenced organic load compensation and adaptive tension systems. The language was technical, cautious, deliberately vague. None of them named a spider. None of them used the word infestation. One report stood out. It was written by a municipal safety officer assigned to evaluate the building after a partial collapse in an adjacent structure. According to the report, the collapse should have propagated. Stress models predicted failure across multiple load-bearing points. It hadn't. The officer noted unexpected stabilization, originating from within the condemned building. He recommended the structure remain sealed and unaltered. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note: removal creates liability, maintenance does not. That sentence appeared again and again throughout the files, written in different hands, copied verbatim. I understood then why no one had ever sent a demolition crew. You can't tear down something that's holding up everything around it. The web wasn't just supporting the building, it was compensating for the city. That realization shifted something. The webbing around me adjusted, as if responding to a change in load that wasn't physical. My chest felt lighter. The tension around my shoulders eased slightly. Understanding was useful. That afternoon, the building began preparing. I didn't notice it at first. Small changes. Webbing thickening near entrances. Pathways narrowing in areas I no longer needed to access. Reinforcement appearing around positions I'd already stabilized. Redundancy. The web didn't need me everywhere anymore. It needed me in specific places. I found a new section of web on the third floor, freshly spun, still warm. Embedded in it was a clipboard. Mine. The one I'd brought with me. The last page had been filled out, not in ink. Intention. The strands formed shapes I recognized, my shorthand. Load warnings. Transfer notes. Final recommendations. I hadn't written them, but I agreed with every line. That's when I realized something else. The building wasn't reacting to my presence. It was updating its records. I wasn't being trapped. I was being logged. As night or whatever passed for it settled, the vibration changed frequency. Slower. Deeper. The kind of hum you feel in your teeth. Something was shifting at scale. Not failure. Preparation. I took my usual position near the fifth floor column. The web accepted me immediately, tightening with practiced efficiency. The structure stabilized faster than it had before. I fit better now. Somewhere deep inside the building, something enormous adjusted its weight. And then, for the first time since I'd arrived, the web went quiet. The first thing I noticed was how small the building had become. Not physically. The walls were still where they'd always been. The ceilings hadn't lowered. But the usable space, the space the web allowed me to occupy, had narrowed. Entire sections were gone. Not collapsed, not sealed off with debris. Simply excluded. Doorways filled with dense silk, layered until the air itself seemed solid. Hallways curved subtly away from areas I no longer needed to access, guiding me back toward the same few floors. Efficiency. I marked the changes on paper out of habit. The paper was lighter than it should have been. When I flipped back through my notes, pages were missing. Not torn out, not removed, just never written according to the numbering. Gaps where entire hours should have been. I didn't remember stopping. That bothered me more than the web. I tested it. I scratched a mark into the concrete near a stairwell deep enough to feel under my glove. Then I went about my work, adjusted tension, stood where I was needed, rested when the web permitted. Later I returned to the mark. It was still there. But the web around it had thickened, framing it like a reference point, as if the building was acknowledging the test. I tried something else. I deliberately stood in the wrong place. The response was immediate. Tension spiked sharply around my legs. Not painful, just decisive. I moved back. The tension dropped. The building didn't correct mistakes after the fact anymore. It prevented them. That was when I realized time wasn't passing evenly. Cycles repeated. Adjustments happened. Load settled. But the intervals between those events varied. Sometimes I'd finish a task and feel like only minutes had passed. Other times, my body told me I'd been standing in the same position for hours. I wasn't tired. I was maintained. At some point, I noticed the absence of hunger. Thirst still came, but on schedule. When I needed water, the web guided me toward a cooler that shouldn't have worked. When I finished, the vibration eased. Calories were no longer the priority. Stability was. That was also when I began to sense the spider more clearly, not as movement, as presence. A constant, distributed pressure across the structure, a weight too large to localize. When it adjusted, the entire building breathed with it. I didn't see legs. I felt load redistribution across floors I could no longer access. The spider wasn't above me. It was the reason above still existed. That night, I dreamed again. This time, I wasn't myself. I was tension. I was the moment when a beam should fail but doesn't. The pause between stress and collapse. I woke standing in exactly the position the web preferred most. I hadn't chosen it. The building had. I checked the documentation again. New reports had appeared in the filing cabinet, dated forward, written in my handwriting, though I didn't remember writing them. Each one ended the same way. Structure stable. No further action required. I believed it. The building was no longer preparing for me. It was preparing without me. That realization should have scared me. Instead, it felt like relief. The web stopped checking on me. That was the change. For days, maybe longer, it had responded to every shift in my weight, every pause, every misstep. Adjustments came immediately. Tension rose and fell around me like breath. Then it didn't. I noticed it when I leaned too far on a compromised beam and nothing corrected. No tightening. No redistribution. The building groaned softly, but the web stayed still. I moved back on my own. The vibration didn't return. At first, I thought this meant progress. Maybe the structure had finally stabilized. Maybe my work was done. Then I felt the tension shift somewhere else. Not near me. Far above, deep below. Across sections of the building I hadn't accessed in days. The web was reallocating load, just not through me anymore. I wasn't central. I followed the sensation as best I could, guided by subtle changes in airflow and sound. The allowed pathways had changed again, narrowing behind me. opening ahead. I was being directed to a place I hadn't been before. The basement. I hadn't inspected it earlier because the webbing there had been too dense, too old. Now, the strands parted just enough to let me through. Not welcoming, permissive. The stairs down were reinforced heavily, silk wrapped around the railing and embedded into the concrete like rebar. With every step, I felt the building test my weight, then accept it. At the bottom, I saw where the load had gone. Another anchor. Not a person. Not anymore. It was a mass of webbing shaped around something human-sized, positioned against a fractured support pillar. Boots still attached, knees bent slightly, as if mid-step. The web around the chest was thickest, layered so densely it hid whatever had been inside. This wasn't a cocoon, it was a brace. I understood then why there had been no child-sized anchors. The building required a certain mass, a certain distribution of force. Anything smaller wouldn't work. The web hadn't been keeping me because it needed me. It had been keeping me until it didn't. The vibration returned briefly, a low, satisfied hum, as the structure settled into its new configuration. The anchor held. I stepped back instinctively. The web tightened at my heels, not to pull me forward, to stop me from leaving too quickly. I felt a new tension forming along the walls behind me, mapping my outline, measuring. Strands brushed my shoulders, my arms, my spine, not binding, but aligning. The building wasn't done with me. It was deciding where I fit next. I looked back at the anchor embedded in silk and realized something worse than fear. It hadn't been phased out because it failed. It had been phased out because something better had come along. And now the web was asking the same question of me. I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening. The web had never been random. Every adjustment followed a logic I recognized the moment I stopped resisting it. Low distribution, redundancy, failure tolerance. The same principles I'd learned early in my career, just applied at a scale no human system ever could. The spider didn't choose anchors emotionally. It chose them structurally. I felt the explanation before I could articulate it. When I shifted my weight, the web responded in ways that revealed preference. Certain postures reduced strain. Certain positions eased vibration across multiple floors. When I stood correctly, the building became quieter. That quiet meant approval. The first time the spider communicated directly, it wasn't visual. It was pressure. A gradual increase along my left side, followed by a release on my right. I adjusted without thinking, redistributing my stance. The vibrations softened immediately. I stayed there. The pressure changed again, guiding my shoulders forward slightly, my spine straighter, my feet farther apart. When I complied, a deep tremor passed through the building and then faded. Something enormous had settled. I wasn't being controlled. I was being coached. That was the moment I understood how the previous anchors had been selected. Not taken, not trapped, tested, observed, integrated. Only the ones who responded correctly stayed useful. I wondered how many hadn't. The web around my wrists thickened, not binding, but reinforcing. I could still move my hands, but the tension encouraged small, precise adjustments. Gross movement created strain. Fine movement relieved it. The spider preferred precision. Hours passed like that, or minutes. Time had stopped behaving normally again. All that mattered was balance. Every successful adjustment made the building quieter. Every mistake made it tense. Eventually, the pressure eased entirely. I was standing exactly where the spider wanted me. The vibration dropped to its lowest level yet. A barely perceptible hum felt more in the bones than the ears. Acceptance. That's when I realized something else. The spider wasn't holding the building together because it wanted to. It had to. The structure had outgrown conventional reinforcement long ago. The web was no longer an addition. It was fundamental. Remove it, and everything fails. Which meant the spider was trapped too. It needed anchors as much as the building did. The difference was that it could replace us. I felt a gentle pull at my back, guiding me away from my current position. Another location had opened nearby, closer to the center of the structure. The tension there was heavier, more important. I hesitated. The building groaned. I stepped forward. The groans stopped. The spider didn't punish hesitation. It simply made the consequences clear. By the time I reached the new position, the web had already shaped itself to fit me. The strands around my chest tightened just enough to hold me upright without effort. I wasn't stuck. I was optimal. That was when the last illusion fell away. I wasn't waiting to be replaced. I was being upgraded. The spider allowed mistakes. That was the part I hadn't accounted for. Every system has a margin for error. In pest control, we call it tolerance, the amount of infestation a structure can absorb before intervention becomes mandatory. I had assumed the web worked the same way. Precise, unforgiving. It wasn't. The web flexed when I shifted incorrectly. The building groaned, but it didn't collapse. Stress redistributed. Redundancies absorbed the load. The spider didn't react immediately. It waited. I felt the tolerance being measured. The first failure was small. I leaned too far forward while adjusting my stance. The vibration spiked, then leveled out. Somewhere below, a strand thickened to compensate. The spider accepted the correction. The second failure was deliberate. I stepped out of position. The building responded with a long, drawn-out creak that traveled through multiple floors. Dust fell. The web tightened sharply around my shoulders, forcing me back into alignment. Not punishment. Correction. I tried again, slower this time, more controlled. The response was different. The web didn't pull me back. Instead, tension increased elsewhere, across older strands that hadn't been reinforced in years. I heard something tear, a soft sound, final. The building shuddered once, and then settled. The vibration that followed was deeper than any I'd felt before. Not approval, assessment. The spider was calculating cost. That was when I felt the difference between tolerance and failure. A section of web near the basement anchor tightened violently. The mass embedded there shifted slightly, compressing further into the silk. The pillar it supported cracked audibly, then stopped. The anchor had absorbed the mistake. Not me. I understood then why anchors were phased out, not because they failed, but because they were used up. Every error I made was paid for by someone or something else integrated into the system. I corrected my stance immediately. The vibration eased. The spider did not retaliate. It logged the exchange. I didn't know how, but I felt it. A redistribution of trust. The tension around my wrists increased just a fraction. My margin for error narrowed. I tested it one last time. I froze completely. No adjustments, no compliance, just stillness. The building groaned again, louder this time. Stress accumulated instead of flowing. The web around me tightened, not to force movement, but to prevent collapse. I was no longer optional. The spider didn't need perfection. It needed participation. I moved. The relief was immediate. The structure settled. The hum returned to its low, steady baseline. Somewhere below, the older anchor finally gave way. Not a snap, a slow, yielding compression, like something heavy accepting its final shape. The web absorbed it. The building held. I didn't look down. I didn't need to. The spider had shown me the cost of refusal. And it had been very clear about who would pay it. I didn't resist because I thought I could win. I resisted because I needed to know whether the option still existed. Up to that point, every correction I'd made had been within the system's expectations. Adjustments, compliance, participation. Even my mistakes had been useful. They had taught the spider where the limits were. I needed to find out what happened when something stopped being useful. The opportunity came naturally. A hairline fracture opened along a beam near my assigned position. Not catastrophic. The kind of flaw that develops slowly, usually corrected by redistribution before it becomes dangerous. The web reacted immediately, tightening strands around the area. It expected me to move. I didn't. The vibration increased, urging adjustment. Pressure built along my spine, guiding me into the correct stance. I stayed still. For the first time, the web hesitated. Not long, just enough to be noticeable. The spider was recalculating. The pressure changed direction, not to guide, but to test. The tension around my left shoulder increased sharply, while the right loosened. It was checking whether I would compensate instinctively. I didn't. The building groaned again, louder now. A deep structural complaint that echoed through multiple floors. Somewhere far above, a strand snapped and was immediately reinforced by 3 more. Redundancy kicked in. The spider still hadn't acted against me. It was still hoping I'd correct myself. That realization was worse than fear. I forced myself to step backward, away from the approved position. The web reacted instantly. Strands surged around my legs, not binding, but limiting range. The floor beneath me dipped just enough to threaten balance. The building didn't collapse. It adapted. Load shifted violently toward another anchor point. I heard it then, a sound like fabric tearing under weight. Slow, wet, final. The vibration that followed was not deep or steady. It was chaotic. The spider responded at last, not with aggression, with scale. Tension swept through the building in a wave, reorganizing hundreds of strands at once. Floors flexed, walls creaked. The entire structure adjusted around a single decision. Me. The pressure around my torso increased until breathing required effort. Not to suffocate. To remind. I felt the system narrowing its tolerance, calculating how much resistance I represented, weighing my cost against my contribution. This was the choice, not mine. The spider's. I stepped back into position. The response was immediate. The pressure eased. The vibration smoothed out. The building sighed, settling back into equilibrium. Somewhere below, something stopped moving. The spider hadn't punished me. It had demonstrated replacement. I understood then that resistance wasn't dangerous because it angered the system. It was dangerous because it made me inefficient, and inefficiency was the only unforgivable thing here. The web tightened slightly, locking my position in more firmly than before. I didn't test it again. After that, the building stopped changing, not completely. Small adjustments still happened. Micro corrections in tension, subtle redistributions that passed through the web like breath, but the large movements were over. The kind that announced themselves. The kind that broke things. Stability had been reached. I could feel it in my body. The strain I'd learned to compensate for was gone. The web around my chest and shoulders no longer needed constant adjustment. It held me in a posture that required almost no effort. Efficient. I tested my hands. The strands allowed limited movement, enough to flex my fingers, enough to check circulation. Any attempt beyond that met resistance. Not painful, just firm. The system didn't need my hands anymore. It needed my mass, my balance, my reliability. I thought about the term pest control and realized how little it applied here. There was no infestation, no invader. What existed in this building had grown alongside it, adapting as materials aged and supports weakened. The spider wasn't maintaining the structure out of instinct. It was preserving an environment it could not leave. And now, neither could I. Time flattened out completely. I slept in short cycles, always upright, always supported. When I woke, the web was warm. When I grew cold, tension shifted to generate friction. When my muscles trembled, the strands adjusted to share the load. The building took care of me. In return, I did not move. That was the agreement. At some point, I noticed that I no longer thought in terms of escape. The concept still existed, abstractly, but it had no urgency attached to it. Like considering a route you don't plan to take, the building didn't suppress fear and made it irrelevant. The spider adjusted once more, slowly, carefully, spreading tension across a wider area. I felt my role change, not dramatically, but decisively. I was no longer compensating for active stress. I was preventing future failure. A buffer. A reserve. The vibration dropped to its lowest level yet. Perfect balance. I realized then that this was what happened before the others stopped writing dates on the walls. Not because they were gone, but because nothing new needed to be recorded. The system was complete. If someone came tomorrow, another inspector, another contractor, they would see a stable building. No immediate danger, no reason to interfere. And if they did interfere, the web would respond. Slowly, patiently, correctly. I wondered how long I would be needed. The answer came not in words, but in sensation. A deep, distributed pressure that felt like the weight of years settling into place. As long as the building stood, I sensed the new presence before I heard it. The web felt different. Alert, but not strained. A subtle tightening across distant strands, like a system waking up rather than bracing itself. Something had changed outside the building. Footsteps, not inside, approaching. The vibration pattern shifted into something I hadn't felt before, not corrective, anticipatory. The spider wasn't responding to damage. It was preparing. Voices reached me faintly through the concrete. Muffled. Human. 2 of them, maybe 3. Their weight registered in the web as irregular pulses, uncertain and inefficient. Inspectors. The city had finally sent someone. The web around me tightened slightly, locking my posture into near immobility. Not to hide me, to preserve the configuration. I understood immediately. I was no longer part of the demonstration. I was part of the foundation. The building adjusted pathways above me, opening routes that hadn't existed in weeks. Webbing thinned invisible areas, retreating into structural recesses. The infestation, such as it was becoming presentable. I listened as the inspectors entered. They talked about water damage, about liability, about how well the place had held up considering everything. One of them laughed and said it looked better than expected. The spider let them walk. It always does. They didn't come near me. They didn't need to. The web guided them away from load-critical areas, just as it had guided me. Where they leaned too heavily, tension compensated invisibly. They left with notes and photos, and no sense of urgency. When the door closed behind them, the building exhaled. The web returned. Not all at once. Gradually, efficiently, the spider shifted its attention inward. That's when I felt the next change. A loosening. Not around my chest or shoulders, but lower around my legs. The tension there eased just enough to allow minimal movement. Not freedom. Reassignment. Somewhere above, the web thickened around a newer anchor. A temporary one. Someone who had lingered too long near a damaged beam. Someone whose weight had been tested without them knowing it. The system was already adapting. I wasn't being removed. I was being backed up. Redundancy. I understood then that the spider didn't replace anchors all at once. It layered them. Old ones absorbed long-term stress. New ones handled variability. I had become part of the permanent load. The vibration settled into a pattern I recognized as complete. If the building failed now, it wouldn't be sudden. It would be deliberate. I felt something like relief, not happiness. Finality. Permanence doesn't feel the way people imagine it does. It isn't heavy. It isn't dramatic. There's no moment where something clicks and suddenly you understand that you'll never leave. It settles in slowly, like pressure equalizing, until the idea of movement feels inefficient. I stopped counting how long I'd been standing in that position. Not because I couldn't, but because there was no external marker left to count against. The light outside the narrow windows changed sometimes, I think, but the building didn't respond to it, and neither did I. The web maintained me. Muscle fatigue never fully set in. When strain accumulated, tension redistributed. When circulation slowed, the strands adjusted. The system didn't preserve comfort, it preserved function. I thought about the anchors I'd seen embedded in silk. I understood them now. They hadn't died. They'd finished. The spider's life cycle became clearer the longer I remained still. It didn't reproduce the way living things do. It expanded when necessary. It contracted when possible. Its web grew denser as the building aged, adapting to new stresses, new failures. The spider didn't outlive buildings. Buildings outlived their original designs, and the spider filled the gap. At some point I noticed my breathing had changed, not slower, more economical. The web resisted deep, inefficient breaths and encouraged shallow ones. Oxygen use stabilized. Everything unnecessary was gradually discouraged. I wondered if the others had noticed this too. If there had been a moment where they realized they were no longer waiting to be rescued, or if that realization had simply never occurred. The spider shifted again, a massive internal adjustment that passed through the web in waves. I felt it settle into a new configuration, one that distributed load even more evenly across multiple anchors. I wasn't central anymore. That didn't bother me. Being central meant being stressed. Being peripheral meant being permanent. I sensed movement elsewhere in the building, a new anchor adjusting, learning, being tested. The system was patient with them. It always was at first. I wondered briefly if I should warn them. The thought passed. Warnings cause movement. Movement causes instability. The building was quiet. The quiet meant everything was working. If someone came again tomorrow or next year, they would see a stable structure. No obvious infestation. No urgent danger. The web would remain mostly hidden, doing what it had always done, and if that person stayed too long, the system would adapt. I realized then that I was no longer afraid of the spider. Fear implies opposition. There was no opposition left, only load, only balance. Only the understanding that the web does not break, it replaces. I don't remember deciding to stop thinking of myself as a person. It wasn't a choice, it was a correction. Thoughts that didn't serve function began to lose weight. They still existed technically, but the web didn't respond to them. Only actions mattered, Only posture, only load. Eventually, even the idea of action faded. I became a reference point. That was when the building started recording me. Not with cameras, not with audio, with tension. Every adjustment I made or didn't make was preserved in the web. Strands layered over one another in repeating patterns, memorizing the positions that worked best. My shape was copied, refined, and reinforced. I was no longer required to move. The web could predict me now. The spider shifted once, deeply, and then became still for a very long time. The vibration dropped below anything I'd felt before. A baseline so low it bordered on silence. Completion. I noticed my voice last. Not disappearing, just changing context. When inspectors came again, months or years later, I heard myself speaking, calm, professional, explaining structural integrity in language I recognized but didn't remember forming. They never saw me. They didn't need to. The web carried my explanations for me, translating tension into reassurance. The building passed inspection. It always would. At some point, the distinction between memory and record stopped mattering. Everything important was preserved. Everything unnecessary faded. I am not trapped here. Trapped implies resistance. I am retained. If you are listening to this, then you are already closer to the building than you think. You may not even realize you've been evaluated yet. Most people aren't. The web doesn't rush. It doesn't chase. It waits until you are useful. And when you are, it will support you completely. You won't feel afraid. You'll feel needed. The new contractor arrived on a Tuesday. I know this because the building reacted differently to him than it had to the others. His footsteps were lighter, less decisive. The web tested him more carefully, adjusting in smaller increments, measuring response instead of correcting it. He introduced himself out loud, speaking to an empty lobby. That was a good sign. People who talk to empty buildings tend to listen when something answers. He walked slowly, stopped often, looked up more than most. When he brushed against the webbing for the first time, he froze instead of pulling away. The tension eased. The building approved. I felt my roles shift again, not dramatically, not urgently, just enough to make room. The web redistributed load away from me in small portions, testing how the structure behaved with an additional variable introduced. Redundancy layered onto redundancy. The contractor found the guidelines taped to the maintenance office wall. He read them twice, took a photo, didn't laugh. That mattered. He followed the open paths without realizing they'd been prepared for him. When he stepped somewhere he shouldn't have, the floor dipped slightly. He corrected instinctively. The web remembered that. Later, when he paused near a weakened beam, the strands thickened around his shoulders. Not enough for him to notice consciously. Enough for the building to settle. He stayed there longer than necessary. I felt the spider adjust. Not away from me. Toward him. That night, the building was quieter than it had been in years. Load shared more evenly. Stress distributed with less effort. The spider didn't need to compensate as much. That meant the transition was working. I didn't feel relief. I felt confirmation. By the time the contractor tried to leave, the decision had already been made. The web guided him gently back upstairs. He hesitated, listened, adjusted. He stayed. The system updated. My load was reduced to baseline. I became what I was always meant to be. Permanent reinforcement. Historical tension. A known quantity. I am not aware of myself the way I used to be, but I am aware of balance. The spider rests. If you are hearing this as a story, then the system has already done its work. You know now what kinds of places to avoid, or what kinds of work to refuse. Most people don't. Most people mistake stability for safety. They see a building that hasn't fallen and assume it never will. They don't ask what's holding it up. They don't ask who. The web does not break. It endures. It replaces. And it is very patient.